First, I should
hello.
thank our panelists for their compassion in concern for each other and for you all, and we've got a little bit of time. I would like to sort of put one quick question to you, although it's not a quickly answered question perhaps, but then I hope we can open this up and we'll end pretty much on time. We've seen a number of different measures, and it seems to me you can think in different ways about the differences. That is, what is the significance of the fact that we've got different measures? One possibility is that we're all trying to measure the same thing, but just doing it in different ways, so that these are all measures of compassion. Another possibility that we've had mentioned and actually emphasized, I think the most consistent, is that compassion is a multifaceted thing, or experience, perspective perhaps. And so the different measures are tapping into different aspects of this. That's a possibility. If that's true, then one begins to wonder, should the science actually be focused on these more specific, measurable aspects rather than on compassion, or is something extremely important lost in that process, and so that somehow it has to be the combined ingredients? It's the combination of ingredients, not doing the science at the level of the more specific things. And how do you do that if that's true? That becomes an enormous issue. We've talked about multiple measures, but coordinating those measures, and I mean, you can imagine the situation where you get effects on some measures, you don't get them on other measures. Does that mean you haven't got compassion? And the third possibility, of course, is that we're measuring different things, some of which simply are not compassion. But I think it's pretty clear everything's related to compassion, and so I'd like to throw this open to you all just for comments, and then I hope we can get everybody involved quickly.
Well, I would say that compassion, like emotions, is a system, a complex system, and an inferred construct. Like we can't, helping behavior, you might be able to measure directly, but once you talk about a more complex state like a compassion or like an emotion, then I guess as an emotion scientist, I never think that any of my measures single-handedly are getting at the emotion. So whether compassion is an emotion or is like an emotion, I think that's a different question, but it creates this sense of just let's get convergent measures and see how they correlate and not expect them to all show the same thing at the same time. But that's a take on it, of looking at it as a complex system that's very familiar to an emotion researcher.
Yeah, and I think I was making the same point in my presentation, that and we don't even have to know exactly whether we can measure it directly. And we don't even have to know yet exactly what it is, because it seems like we spend a lot of time trying to resolve, is it an emotion, is it a relationship, is it a perspective, is it a motivation? We're forming a sense of that, but it is complex, and we all acknowledge it, and it was very multifaceted, so we can approximate it from many indicators, but also we can, and I made this point aside, we can see what compassion would do, like what effect does being compassionate have on a number of different outcomes. So that's another way to kind of cast this more indirect approach.
I would just say it's so important that we make our definitions explicit. In some ways it's silly to argue what is compassion, what is mindfulness, what is self-compassion, in the sense that we might be using the same term to describe slightly different meanings. There's nothing wrong with the different meanings. You know, the debate is just which term should we use to describe what. So if we're all very explicit about what we are trying to tap into, like I think that the different multiple ways of approaching self-compassion, everyone was using the same definition, and therefore I feel fairly comfortable seeing these as multiple modalities of measuring the same thing. But I think with compassion in general and also mindfulness in general, because there's so much variation and what do we mean when we use that word, then it becomes much more difficult to get this multiple ways of pointing to a particular phenomena. So it's really our responsibility to be very clear about what we mean when we define these terms. It's also our responsibility to accept that other people define it differently, and that's okay. They're just talking about something slightly different.
Yeah, I would just add to that, I think that's really critical, and just is to even call the definitions working definitions, to kind of invite revision over time, and then we can see which definition is useful, what is it predicting, and then use the data to help us go back and say, this was a particularly useful definition, so let's learn that way, because it's not going to be, one person writes it down and then, we all will know that that works. There's going to be a lot of variety across different laboratories.
And I suppose I would take it even a step further. I feel that the more I hear people talk about compassion and these different perspectives people taking on it, it's a little like when people talk about time. And you talk to a biologist about time, he says one thing. You talk to a physicist, he talks about the history of the cosmos. You talk to a social psychologist, Phil Zimbardo, about cultural aspects of time. And when you're done with it, it's like you're talking about life. So what do you think about life? And in many ways, I think the ways you could talk about compassion, it's like I talk about good. What is good? And so it's just extremely important to pick your questions carefully and define what it is that you're looking for, and hopefully what you do will somehow relate to what somebody else does, and then it gets bigger.
Yeah, I might not answer the question, but I'm thinking of this physiological background. It's good to be on a good vagal tone, and you should be safe, and then you could be compassionate. I don't know if of course it increases the ability, but if you listen to this book by Monroe, I haven't read it, but doing compassionate things although you are in a fear state, that's really interesting, I think, too. So that's making the thing much more complex.
Are there people that have questions? I guess there are mics. There's a mic here, and we can.
If compassion has a sense of being immeasurable, my sense of what that means is that it just keeps growing, and it grows in breadth in terms of its application, and it grows in depth. I don't think it stops. I think it's a very, very dynamic thing. So I think measuring the immeasurable, I think, has to keep that dynamic in mind, because it's a life thing. So so it's a comment, but I'd be very interested in what you have to say.
I have a couple thoughts on that. I really take to heart what you say about compassion as being dynamic. And one thing that's always difficult when you're doing like laboratory research is you feel like you're putting these artificial constraints on something that has such life force and dynamism. And one way, I didn't get into the complexities of it in my brief presentation, but one way in which we were trying to honor that and acknowledge that, if that were the case, was really look at, even in our brief scenario, how there was an unfolding of the emotional response over time. And we actually did see some patterning in response to this kind of thing. We saw this emotion, and then what happened later. And then also longitudinal changes over time. In broader affective measures we did in our study, we had this global construct called adaptive functioning, and how that grew over the course of the training over 3 months and carried on over 5 months, a year, whatever, in the course of their lives. We're also doing some really rich interview analyses and relating those to more, which are all qualitative analysis of how people talk about their lives and their relationship to difficult situations, etc., and how those change. So I was giving one piece, but we're really trying to build a picture from multiple, more microscopic measures, more macroscopic measures, laboratory, more ecologically valid, and now we're trying to carry on by getting ratings and information from the people in the lives of the people we trained to see what impact that had. And these are all, still just approximations, but we're trying to, complete the picture as much as possible.
First of all, thank you. Fabulous panel, wonderful presentations from everyone. Erika, this is a question for you. And with regards to shamatha data, if you guys had had the opportunity to capture other signals of emotion besides the face, like perhaps postural leans, do you think your sadness would have sort of separated from a more bodily constriction that is evocative of social support, which is really characteristic of sadness, as opposed to a forward lean that is a characteristic of an approach or a caregiving instinct? I agree with you. I don't think the face is necessarily going to differentiate compassion, but do you think in combination with other modalities we might actually be able to have a measure of compassion?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, and I think the reason I presented the relationship between the self-ratings and the sadness, what I'm in the paper talking about is like a configuration, because it could be that we're seeing actual sadness there, and that how often you feel sadness is a marker of an engagement with suffering. It could be that these facial signals are also a broader indicator of being connected and moved by someone's experience. And the fact that we see a pattern here, sadder looking but not pushing away, implies engagement. The sympathy ratings imply engagement. They were not reporting being sad. The film viewing situation is a hard one to evaluate that, but we also have interview data. We have all kinds of other contexts in which to look more, and other behavioral indicators of moving toward. But I think that's a really important point. Yeah.
Hi, my question's for Barbara Fredrickson, but anyone can, of course, answer if they would so wish. So I was thinking about the preconditions of love that you had, and one of them was connection, and specifically face-to-face contact or physical contact. And I work in online environments and social networking. So I was hoping if you could address the issue of creation of love in an online context and whether or not that would really be love and compassion. For example, if I'm looking at someone through Skype and I'm smiling at my boyfriend, are we smiling? Are we in, biosynchronous contact of some sort? And could you define that as love or something else?
Right. That's a really great question. I think that's a great place for us to be doing future studies. I think that there's a bigger chance with Skype and shared video and shared behavior when you can see the smile and have that evoke the changes that a smile makes in a person in terms of their sort of gut sense of having that cognitive tuning to another person's intention. I think we're able to do that a bit with voice, with shared voice, but voice carries much more of the sort of arousal channel and not so much of the valence channel. That's what we know from that. So I think we have a sense of when people are getting engaged, but you don't quite know if that's nervous engagement or positive engagement. So voice hobbles us a bit. If you go to much non-synchronous interaction, I think it's a lot tougher because then you're working with people's written verbal records, and you know that every time someone does LOL, they're not actually laughing out loud. It's a communication norm, and so there's so many places where we read what people are intending to communicate, but we can't run that through our biological embodied sincerity check, and so to be able to see somebody eye to eye and have that co-feeling, we don't have to be reasoning with our minds, are they being sincere? We know it with our bodies, that sincerity is there. But if we just have a verbal record, we might need to draw on a lot of history about that person and our relationship with them to know whether there's just authenticity there.
I just want to say something about Skype. As a facial scientist and a compassion researcher, and it's weird. And that's my scientific, and there's a reason why. Your camera's here, you're looking at the screen, you can't get eye contact. So it won't work. My hypothesis is it's very difficult to work. In fact, my friend and colleague Tanya Singer, this wonderful neuroscientist in Germany who studies compassion, many of you know about, she and I were talking about Skyping some compassion dyadic exercises, and audio only. It doesn't work. She says she's pilot. It doesn't work because you can't get the eye contact. So I just wanted to add that point in.
Hi, my question is also for Dr. Fredrickson. I'm tremendously intrigued by your definition of love requiring mutuality. For instance, there are parents who might love a very difficult child that was not giving reciprocal affection or love. I could say that I have a deep love for the Dalai Lama, but I've not been blessed with a lot of FaceTime. I'm really curious about how you came to that definition and how you might label those other emotions, a parent for a child that doesn't reciprocate, or me for the Dalai Lama, or any other relationship that you might call it love, but it doesn't seem to be mutual.
You know, that is the biggest trouble with actually using the word love here, because people have so many pre-existing definitions of love. And I guess I didn't quite mention it this way, but how I'm thinking about it is that these moments of positivity resonance with the eye contact, with the biobehavioral synchrony, that's what our bodies know to be love. Okay, so, and that may create devotion and bonds. And those devotion and bonds and loyalty might allow you to continue to say, I love my difficult child, even when my difficult child is not having any mutual connection back. But in terms of what fuels our bodies and makes us healthier and with better well-being, I think that there is something unique about those shared micro moments that include all of those. So I wanted to call those out as distinct, and yet just calling them positivity resonance does not necessarily elevate them up to a level of importance that people think, oh, I should understand this jargon term, positivity resonance. That, you know, calling it love, I use that to draw people in and to help people see love in a new way.
So for instance, like my example with my sense of love for the Dalai Lama, would you call that something else? I mean, I haven't had that mutual experience. Yeah. I'm fairly certain he doesn't know who I am.
Yeah, I would, but you have been part of all beings in his meditations. So, but I think that might be the difference between attitudes and emotions, that you have a very strong and warm and tender attitude towards him, but that sense of I would reserve emotion for a micro moment experience, and not something that is a longer lasting belief or attitude. That can be obviously extraordinarily important in one's life, so I'm not saying that it's not less important. I think it follows more the shape of an attitude.
But some people would put love at that level, yes, too.
Exactly.
They would put love at the level of what you're calling an attitude.
Exactly.
Or a disposition.
Exactly.
Can I just follow up a question for Barbara related to that? Does maybe you're defining love differently than compassion, certainly, because does it have to be positive? So for instance, I'm thinking one of the most powerful love moments I had with my son was, and he is autistic, so you know these moments are, well, no, they happen a lot, but it might be a bit different. But we came back from a trip and our cat had died, went missing. And we cried together. Mm-hmm. And it was just this amazing experience of love and closeness, and really, really altered our relationship, the experience of crying together. Right. So does it have to be positive to be love?
Right. Well, I don't think it has to be exclusively positive, but I think in that moment of crying together, there's that shared humanity, that I'm not in this alone, and that part of the experience feels good.
Okay.
And so that there is the blend of the negative and the positive. So if there's, from the way I've been thinking about it, if there's a strand of positivity, even if the sufferer is just recognizing that you're with me as I suffer, that the suffering person can have a strand of good feeling next to their suffering, and that allows this resonance to emerge.
Thank you.
I've been hoisted on my own petard here and given a 0. But I'd like to, if we can just quickly go through the remaining questions and just sort of at high speed.
Okay. First, I think regarding the immeasurables and what we're doing as researchers, as scientists measuring the immeasurables, I think the immeasurables are the immeasurables, and what we're really doing is researching their emergence through human behavior. So making that distinction has been really helpful for me, because knowing that compassion and love, these are, you can't really measure, but we can measure changes in our behavior. And then my actual question is for Erika, which we'll do briefly here. When you had the picture of the suffering boy on the image and you left it there, it wasn't like you just showed it to us. It was like the experience of being a compassionate community and then having it remain there and looking at it and then knowing we're not supposed to turn away from suffering, and then looking at it and not being able to really look at it because there's nothing we could do about it. And that sort of, that dynamic was interesting to me, just to reflect on it, to the point where I wanted to ask you, in leaving it there, was to explore your intention, and then that idea of researching when we have that experience, exploring compassion and not being able to respond to the problem, and what's actually happening in human beings, and that deadening or increasing the experience of wanting to change things, altruism.
Okay, let's see if I can do this quickly. Because on the one hand, there's a quick answer that the intention, I left it up there longer because I was going through my bullet points. So it wasn't a compassion manipulation. But you touch on something that's core in the teaching of compassion. Because one of the things that comes up when you start encouraging people to be present with suffering is a sense of overwhelm. How can I possibly do anything about it? You know, right. And so then the thing to do in the training is to take more manageable pieces and you're building up, but also on the large scale, that the more that you're willing to be present with that and see it and hold it and see how it feels in you, that is a transformative experience in you. And that then is something you bring to every encounter in your life. So that you're in being more willing to be present with suffering and seeing how it affects you and being motivated to make a difference. That maybe you won't touch that child on the other side of the planet directly, but by this infinite web of connections and your actions will affect others immediately. And what we do find that people make huge transformative changes in your life, so you are taking away from the suffering in the world.
Thank you.
We're going to have to speed up even faster.
Hi, everybody. So much information, I'm trying to assimilate everything. I think I'm doing okay. But with the definition of love, there was one thing that I couldn't understand, and it's that it's not unconditional. And when I think about love and about everybody, if I put my heart and I ask my heart, I want to love everybody in this room, I can just do it immediately. If I say I'm going to love all nature, all the birds, everybody, the heart has like this ability to just love everything unconditionally and without limits. So I was struggling there. I don't know if you can like put some clarity.
That's a beautiful description that you've offered. Thank you. I think that the reason I use the word not unconditional is that I want to set up from an emotion science perspective, emotions are evoked by certain situations, and in that, and so there's some preconditions that are set up. So it's not that you we always have this constant experience of love. I really want to look at these momentary upwellings of the experience of love. And the conditions of that, in your example, would be thinking, I want to feel love for everybody in this room. And so you get into a mindset that says, I want to evoke this. So that bypassed perhaps the eye contact or physical connection piece, but it was an appraisal or a wish or an intention. There, I think that the main difference is I would like to focus on these momentary micro experiences, but that focusing on how you are similar perhaps with other people is sort of a way, and how you are connected to nature might be sort of undercurrents in what allows you to get into that state. So lots of room for dialogue here. I'm not saying this is a definitive definition. So thank you.
I'll try to be succinct. This is primarily for Dr. Fredrickson. I was wondering if there's any research on cultivating these moments of positive resonance through, like, the practice of of social interaction, like say giving people homework assignments, like, okay, now you're going to practice making eye contact and really focus on making good eye contact. You're going to practice on smiling more and being more emotionally expressive, and you're going to be focused on, like, feeling the connection with that person. And through these sort of assignments, and possibly also through combining this with a compassion practice as well, is there any research on this, or is this kind of a further frontier?
That, I think, would be for the future. One of the things I would caution with that is that giving, I think nonverbal behavior really emanates from emotions, and sometimes it can throw people off their game of actually connecting with people if they're thinking really hard, now I should be smiling, now I should be making eye contact. So my approach is to intervene with people offline, more from having people, you know, we've done loving kindness training, but also just having people reflect on, when did you feel really connected and attuned with people? So even just looking at that, at having people reflect on moments of connection, seems to be a kernel active ingredient within the loving kindness connection. And it's not going straight for eye contact and smiles. It's just, what does it feel like to feel that moment of energizing connection?
Just to add that, but doing the manipulation of encouraging people to make eye contact can be a powerful opportunity for connection. So.
And if I could just mention in one moment, as long as we're talking about the moment, there's work, Phil Zimbardo again, about expanding the present, about mentally expanding the present.
We'll expand it just a little further.
Very good. I am an executive coach, and I'm currently working with the Institute for HeartMath. And you're probably familiar with what they do with heart rate variability and their study of the innate intelligence of the heart. And this morning, I was so encouraged to see so much discussion about the heart. And I'm curious in regard to corporate social responsibility, and these are areas that I'm very interested in working with executives on. How do you think compassion might relate to this innate intelligence that they're finding resides in the heart? And is this something that you see as an area for study in relation to compassion and increasing compassion in human beings?
It's a great question. I think that that's part of our research agenda, is to figure out what are the organizational and community repercussions for doing this compassion work. How does it show up in terms of how you lead, how equity and concerns are raised? So those are all, you know, tremendous questions. I don't know of good research that really has tracked that to that level yet, but it's a really important agenda.
And I also think it's important to take that more into the work-life stress research. You have a lot of research on job strain, also private life, working life conflicts and so, but you don't have much about compassion in working life, so that could really, yeah. much more done there.
Very, very quickly, just I don't know about the heart rate variability as much, but there's a lot of interest in the business community in teaching leaders self-compassion and how that might actually help them manage the stress of their position in a way that they can not be burnt out and stay less, more open to themselves and then open to others. So.
I'm going to blow the whistle. I hope you'll join me in thanking panelists.